One of the best ways to characterize living entities is not through any of the features or properties usually considered to define it, such as replication, metabolism, or evolution. Rather, living entities are generators of meaning. Explain what generators of meaning means for a biological system.
Hmm. Um, okay, the way I look at it is this: that any organism is inundated with information. There's all sorts sort of coming to us, and we have to decide as organisms what to attend to and what not to. And some of that decision is made, in effect, by evolution. So our sense of smell is not particularly good. It's not particularly salient because smell for us hasn't been a particularly important thing for us to have to attend to. Um, so that's already sort of done. But in our daily lives, we have to sort of attend to some things and figure out what's important. Is that noise something I should worry about, or is it something I can switch off to? So that's the challenge that organisms face. And we have the systems for assimilating, for taking in and for integrating that information so as to come to some decision. And whether I'm talking about the whole organism, whether I'm talking about individual cells, or even at the sort of tissue level, um, uh, those decisions are ones that I think can meaningfully be thought about as decisions about meaning. What meaning, what value does this information have to me? Um, so and it's about those decisions can change in different situations. That in the value of attending to the smell of food for us is more important when we're really hungry than it isn't. So when we're not. So I think that's really what living things are doing all the time. That they're integrating this information and in effect making value judgments about how to weigh those different inputs that they're having. And I do think there's a genuine sense in which we can think of the kind of colloquial idea we have about meaning, that we have, that whether a work of art or a piece of music sort of has meaning for us or not. I think that's only really the sort of extrapolated example of something that happens all the way down or I shouldn't really say down, but through the biological system, right down to single cells. So we have this sophisticated neural machinery for creating a sense of meaning and for a sense of salience and for a sort of valence, whether it's good or bad. But I think that we can see something like that all the way down to single cells, even though, again, I don't believe myself that there's any sentience, there's any flicker of awareness there. Some biologists do, but I don't know quite what that would mean. But I still think that individual cells are having to say, they might automatically tend to respond to a concentration gradient of nutrient. But if there's very low moisture or if there's, heat in that direction or something, they might not do. They're having to make a judgment about sort of, the value to them of that particular signal. So that's what I mean in a biological context.
Yes. What do you think is, because like, would you say that a cell is even in of itself a higher level meaning system? Like, I'm curious what you think the lowest level meaning system in biology is. Like, what is the absolute minimal ingredient list within a system required to make it an agent that is making meaning from its environment?
I think that's a great question, and I wouldn't want to be too definitive on it because I think it's
Yes.
it is a funny one. I mean, I mentioned these blobs called condensates, which I think are they're kind of integrators of information. So they too are probably in a sense they're having to weigh up information. I mean, the example I was thinking of was where two different types of condensate seem to be making judgments about for yeast cells about which cell type to become, whether to proliferate, whether to go into a sort of mating competent state, or whether to just go into a quiescent state. And that decision seems to be made in part on the basis of how old the cells are. So, the meaning of different signals that they might get, pheromone signals or whatever, will be, their age will be factored into that.
Yeah.
So even at that sort of subcellular level, there's something of that sort going on. And I think even at the level of individual proteins, particularly if they're these, very sort of floppy proteins that could do various different things, they have various different states they might occupy, or things they might bind to. Even there, we might be able to, make a case for there being some kind of, certainly contextual judgment that they're making about which partner to bind to. So I think it's going to be fuzzy. I mean, I guess I kind of feel it feels to me more clear cut at the level of the whole cell, because that's an organism. That's something that can, replicate itself. That is something that I think there's pretty general agreement is a living thing. Whereas below that, even at the level of viruses, there's debate about, whether we can think of those as living at all. And I don't think many biologists would want to think of proteins as being living. So, to the extent that I think living things, that life itself is a kind of a meaning imbued state of matter, then I think it makes sense to think of it at the level of cells and above. Below
Interesting.
that, it becomes, hazy, but I suspect it's still a useful concept.
It's funnily enough, that seems a little arbitrary for me. I've gotten more radical on this. The more episodes I do, I've gotten more radical on this. In that, if your definition is just that it's not just, it's still complex, but that the system is taking information from its environment, noisy information, ambiguous information, and it's kind of self-generating its state based on that signal, based on something internal, and then it's changing its performance, physiological state, action, goal, behavior based on that. It feels hard to me to place that line at the level of the cell, because based on everything you've kind of said today, and what I got from how life works is like I would absolutely ascribe that to a protein, and maybe even further. I had a conversation with a panpsychist 2 weeks ago, and maybe I'm a panpsychist now. I can't figure it out. But drawing the line sort of in any place almost seems like more logically inconsistent than just keep on going down, because there's some level of information integration happening. There's some state change based on that information. It's almost more that we're just kind of resistant to give those labels to those things, because we're like, no, I can't, no, I don't think a protein has agency. But the more and more I do the podcast, I'm definitely getting more radical on this, as I find it harder to know where the line is. Like Michael Levin said, if you're going to draw the line, you have to tell me why. And there's never a great reasoning for it. Only just a kind of like an innate, like, no, that's silly. But then if you kind of go past it logically, like it's a difficult one to do.
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy with that position. I
Yeah.
absolutely wouldn't want to make that line a hard and fast, dogmatic line. So I'm very open to that way of thinking. I mean, I suppose, like I say, I think the the cell seems to be the minimal living unit, in the sense that it's something that is able to reproduce itself, which a single protein by itself can't do. Um, so there does seem to be a kind of qualitative distinction there, although again, as I say, viruses are ambiguous in that respect. I mean, that's why I kind of think I'm not particularly interested in the question of whether viruses are alive or not. It's more
Yes.
important to me to think about whether they have agency or not. And it seems to me that when they are in a host, they have agency. When they are outside of that, they're pretty much inert chemicals. And that seems to be a more, meaningful distinction to make. And I think the same is true with, subcellular systems. But to me, I think possibly the more important thing is to recognize that there is a continuity of, for want of a better term, of ways of being. That if you're going to have the cell as an agential system, it's not suddenly going to spring out of something that at the subcellular level works in a completely different sort of machine-like way, that suddenly creates this thing that isn't machine-like. Actually, I think that the more important thing to me seems to be to recognize that at the lower level, certainly down to individual proteins, there are going to be attributes they that have something in common with the cell as an agential system, rather than being sort of perfectly sort of rigid machine-like molecules that somehow magically combine to give, to suddenly give this agential problem. So I think this agential entity. So I think that thinking in terms of these sort of fuzzier, contextual, responsive properties, thinking about the subcellular systems down to individual proteins, that's the key thing, that you've
Yes.
already got sort of elements of the agent as a cellular whole. Whether or not you've got genuine agency, you've got elements of it at that lower level.
What experiment do you think would be done where you'd say, "Oh, that's genuine agency in a protein"? Like, what is that definition for you? Are you is the pro does the protein have multiple potential things that it could do, and then it's changing its state based on some signal in the environment, and then you can prove that it's changing its decision, changing its behavior, it's changing its state in some way? Like, I'm curious what genuine agency looks like and what little, because it's a distribution, right? Where no one's saying a protein is the same amount of agency as a human being. But are they categorically different things, or is it all a continuum and there is levels of agency there?
Well, the definition I use for agency, and it's not meant to be a dogmatic one, it's a fairly loose one, but it's I'd say that it's the ability to manipulate oneself and one's environment in order to try to attain some self-determined goals. And I think that cells can be seen to fulfill that. So the question would be, is there some way in which all of that could be true of a protein? How does a protein, what goals would a protein have? It's not clear to me that a protein would be able to have autonomous goals, and that it could I mean, I could see that it could manipulate its environment. I guess that's what proteins do. They're enzymes, they're catalysts, so to some extent it has that. I could see actually that it could, in a sense, it could manipulate itself if it has this kind of floppiness, although more often what seems to happen is that other proteins will do some of that manipulation by, for example, sticking phosphoryl groups, charged groups on it that might, change its kind of conformation. But to some degree, it'll have a conformational landscape that it can explore. So I could see.
It's a
I
slippery
it,
slope.
it's be interesting to explore if that definition is one that we think is reasonable for agency. You
Yeah.
know, could we imagine a situation in which a protein could show that sort of behavior? It's not obvious to me that it could do all of that, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, it's like it's definitely not as crazy an idea as it once seemed, right? The more we learn about these biological systems and what they're doing, it's like it's harder to remain very logically consistent with what you're saying and then say, "Ah, but no, it can't be at the level of the protein." Because, like, I would argue that probably those tick boxes in some degree are all met at maybe even simpler levels than proteins. I don't know, smaller proteins. Like, it just seems very hard to know where the line is, and very hard to also know what the experiments we need to do to figure this out. Like, what do the experimental paradigms look like where we would actually decipher this? That's also pretty hard to know.
Yeah, and I'm not at all sure that anyone would be able to come up with an experiment that everyone would agree is a kind of benchmark for agency or not, that comes up with a binary answer. I'm not sure if that would actually be a useful thing to do either. In a sense, it doesn't much matter to me if I'd certainly want to argue for agency at the cell and above. It doesn't matter much to me whether we can make a case for lower levels. I don't sort of instinctively reject that idea. It's a question of whether it's still a productive way to think about it. I mean, I think
Yes.
about that in the same way as, there are some people who argue that there is a kind of awareness, a kind of wouldn't say consciousness, but a sentience in individual cells. I'm not, I don't want to sort of reject that as, just being crazy. It's more a question for me of, does that remain a productive, a useful way to think about that sort of system?
Yes.
Um, and I guess it's not clear to me when you would have such minimal sentience. I'm not sure that that there would be much difference between sort of regarding it as, minimally sentient and not sentient at all. I'm not sure why it would be worth drawing a line there. So it's really a question of whether it's a productive way to think.
Yeah. I like again Michael Levin's sort of spectrum of persuadability, right? What can you persuade a system to do with the right tools? And I guess maybe if you were to, it's less important about the label that we give it, but it's more important on, well, what could we persuade a protein to do? Is there applications in regenerative medicine where if we fully knew how to get the protein to behave in a particular way, maybe the space of possible behaviors for a protein is actually a lot larger, particular proteins a lot larger than we think. And then we might be able to get it to do productive things. So it having the label of agent or not is less relevant than, well, maybe it can be persuaded to do useful things biologically that we didn't even think of. I don't know, but I would say that's certainly plausible.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Mike will have thought about this far more deeply than me, and I'd, certainly want to listen closely to what he has to say. That makes me think that a concept I think that is very useful in thinking about these sorts of questions is that of affordance.
Yeah.
What are the possibilities that a protein has? And I think actually it seems to me that biology is in the business of generating molecules with affordances rather than with very closely defined functions. Many of the most important molecules we have are ones that have particular affordances in the sense that they could find useful functionality. And I think, sometimes that's probably what's happening with a lot of transcription of bits of the genome that aren't traditionally thought of as you know genes with functions. So making all these RNA molecules, some of them won't have any functionality at all, and some of them could be usefully regarded as just noise, as just the transcription apparatus not being very selective about what it transcribes. But I think that there's a point at which we can also think it's making things with affordances. Those RNA molecules might be able to find some useful job to do in the cell, and we find, examples where they really do.
Yeah. Do you shy away from using the word consciousness for any specific reason? Do you just don't want to get into the debates about what it means, or you just you don't want to dip your toes in those waters? Do you not use sort of that word on purpose?
I guess, yeah, I guess I do not use it on purpose because I think it's likely to provoke a response.
Yeah.
It's not, it's kind of unnecessarily provocative, I suppose, because I think there are other ways we can talk about it, and because it's another of these terms that we don't have a good definition of, a clear definition of, and we certainly don't have a good scientific understanding of. So. I think it causes more trouble than it's worth to invoke that. Sentience is perhaps a less, controversial term to use, but even that, for to talk about the sentience of a protein, I'm not quite sure whether that would be at all helpful.
Yeah. So are you describing sentience here as some awareness of its own self?
Yes, yes, that's right. As some kind of, I suppose, really some kind of valence attached to the signals that are being received. Whether it's whether is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? So it's I suppose it relates to this question of value and of meaning. Um, but exactly how it does, I'm wary about talking about, because I don't think we certainly don't have a good definition of sentience. I suppose it again, it's more a sort of pragmatic question of, is this going to repel some people who needn't be repelled if we don't, invoke this term, and is there anything lost in, treading around it rather than claiming that things are sentient? But at the level of a cell, I freely admit I'm open-minded and also somewhat confused about how we think about the terms like that.
I think open-minded and confused could be the tagline for my podcast. To be honest, that is remarkably exactly what it's been like, and radicalized episode by episode. As I'm just like, I mean, maybe like I have no idea. It's just so interesting. One area we discussed in our last podcast was these brain organoids, right? Where these question of defining sentience and awareness kind of does become important. Like figuring out what experience would even mean like for a cell, and if it's possible of having a negative valenced experience, what that should mean in terms of how we harvest these brain organoids and use them, right? I mean, so there are sort of interesting and weird areas in synthetic biology where this stuff is maybe becoming important, and trying to figure out, like, is there a negative valence there? Like, what are the important characteristics in guiding our synthetic biology as we do more and more kind of weird gene editing, weird regenerative medicine stuff? Maybe definition. I don't know if definitions become more important, but definitely like clarity of what experience is for these smaller systems, and if they are capable of negative experience.
Yeah, well, I did entirely agree that it's a question that we're going to have to grapple with. Certainly in areas like that of developmental biology and stem cell biology, and what's now being called generative biology, where we're growing these quite complex structures that look like, well, in particular when they look something like little brains, that we have to begin to ask these. Well, we have to be already asking those questions. So I don't think I'm ever going to be concerned about the well-being of my individual cells, or even the notion of, emotions or pain in an individual neuron. But clearly, at some point in the complexity between an individual neuron and a neural network this size, something develops, something emerges, and we don't know when and we don't know how. I've had a brain organoid grown myself from my own skin cells, and several of them actually, and I didn't feel a kind of duty of welfare towards them because I knew they were, too simple to feel that that was something I needed to worry about. But they were active. These neurons are active. They're signaling to each other. It's the stuff of thought, even if it's not thought itself. So I think it's entirely proper that that discussion is happening at that level of biological research. And the same is true for these embryo models that are being grown from stem cells that are, assemblies basically of stem cells, and that are, might be more or less specialized and that can self-assemble without ever having seen an egg or sperm cell, can self-assemble into embryo-like structures and start to develop. And that there too, we don't have a good framework for how to think about that in relation to human life and human-like structures.
Yeah.
And I think probably the important thing to do is to acknowledge that gap, that we don't have ready-made frameworks for how to think about brain organoids or about embryo models ethically and morally, and to some extent even biologically. Um, so simply recognizing that it acknowledges that it's a complex question that we're going to have to find answers for de novo, really.
Yeah.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free